The colony ship Prometheus Dawn barely made it into orbit around the ice world of Kale 9. Its metal hull was torn and burned from a terrible accident in hyperspace that had killed more than half the people on board. The ship looked like it had been through hell, and in many ways it had. Inside, the survivors were scared, exhausted, and running out of everything they needed to stay alive. Food was getting scarce. Medical supplies were almost gone. The heating systems were failing. Every day, people had to make harder and harder choices just to see another sunrise on this frozen nightmare of a planet. Nobody had signed up for this. They were supposed to be colonists heading to a new paradise world, not desperate survivors clinging to life on a ball of ice. When little Emma Cole's parents died from radiation poisoning 2 weeks after the crash, the situation became even worse. Her mother, a biologist, had been exposed while trying to repair the ship's reactor. Her father, refusing to leave his wife's side, caught a fatal dose while caring for her. They died within days of each other, leaving their 3-year-old daughter alone in a community that was barely holding itself together. The council meeting that night was one of the ugliest things the survivors had ever witnessed. Elder Thomas Reed stood at the front of the cramped shelter, his face hard as stone. He was a retired military commander used to making tough calls, but this was different. This wasn't war. This was a child. "We have to face facts," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "We have enough food for maybe 3 months if we ration carefully. We have 42 people to feed. Every person who can't work, who can't help us survive, is a drain on resources we simply don't have." Dr. Lisa Morgan jumped to her feet. She was young, idealistic, and she'd been the one caring for Emma since her parents died. "She's a child. We can't just abandon her because she's not useful right now. What kind of people does that make us?" "The kind who survive," Thomas shot back. "I don't like this any more than you do, but we're talking about the survival of our entire colony. In a few years she might be able to help. But we don't have a few years. We might not have a few months." The argument went back and forth for hours. Some people agreed with Thomas, saying they had to be practical. Others sided with Lisa, saying they couldn't lose their humanity just to stay alive. But when the vote came, fear won out over compassion. 24 people voted to abandon Emma. 17 voted to keep her. 1 person abstained. They didn't call it murder. They didn't even call it abandonment, really. They called it making a hard choice and doing what's necessary. They told themselves pretty lies to make it easier to sleep at night. They wrapped Emma in every thermal blanket they could spare, dressed her in the warmest clothes they had, and prepared her for what they all knew was coming. The ice storms on Kale 9 were legendary, even before the colony arrived. The planet's atmosphere created massive temperature drops that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. Winds reached speeds that could pick up a grown man and throw him like a toy. Ice crystals formed that were sharp enough to cut through metal if they hit hard enough. Nothing survived outside during a storm. Nothing was supposed to, anyway. When the storm warning sirens started blaring, they knew it was time. Thomas carried Emma outside himself. He figured he owed her that much at least. She didn't understand what was happening. She just knew the nice man was taking her outside, and she was scared of the wind and the cold. He found a small rocky outcrop about 50 meters from the shelter, a place where the wind wouldn't hit quite as hard. He set her down, made sure her blankets were wrapped tight, and then he walked away. He didn't run. He didn't look back. If he had done either, he might have changed his mind, and he couldn't afford to do that. Inside the shelter, Lisa was crying. Others sat in silence, staring at their hands or the floor or anything but each other. They'd just sentenced a child to death, and they all knew it. They told themselves it would be quick, that she wouldn't suffer long, that the cold would make her sleepy and she'd just drift away. They needed to believe that. The storm hit with its usual fury. Blue and white ice crystals battered against the shelter's reinforced walls. The temperature outside dropped to minus 150 degrees Celsius. The wind howled like a living thing, angry and hungry. Inside, people huddled around their small heaters and tried not to think about the little girl freezing to death just outside their walls. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. Far up in the glacial mountains that ringed the valley where they'd built their shelter, something ancient was stirring. The dragons of Kale 9 had been on this world for thousands of years, long before humans even dreamed of space travel. They'd watched the strange metal ship fall from the sky. They'd observed these new creatures struggling to survive in the ice and cold. And now, one of them felt something that made his ancient blood stir. Vorthax the Eternal, a dragon whose copper and black scales had survived 10,000 storms, felt the tiny spark of life guttering out in the valley below. He felt it the way you might feel a candle flickering in a dark room, small and fragile and about to go out forever. Dragons had senses humans couldn't understand, couldn't even imagine. They could feel heat and life itself, could sense the difference between a dying ember and a flame that refused to be extinguished. And this little spark, this tiny human life, was refusing to die. Vorthax the Eternal launched himself from his mountain perch, his massive wings cutting through the freezing air like knives through silk. He was older than any living thing the humans had ever encountered. His scales were the color of polished copper mixed with volcanic glass, and they had protected him through 10,000 ice storms over countless centuries. He'd seen civilizations rise and fall on this frozen world. He'd watched species adapt or die. But he'd never felt anything quite like this. The sensation pulled at him like an invisible thread. It wasn't just heat he was sensing, though dragons could detect thermal signatures from incredible distances. This was different. This was life itself, a tiny flickering flame in an ocean of cold and darkness, and it was fighting with everything it had not to go out. Most creatures, when faced with Kale-9's brutal storms, simply gave up. Their bodies surrendered to the inevitable cold. But this small spark was different. It burned with a stubbornness that reminded Vorthax of dragon fire itself. The storm didn't bother him. Winds that would tear a human apart merely ruffled his scales. Ice crystals that could slice through metal bounced harmlessly off his armored hide. He'd flown through worse, much worse, back when Kale-9's climate was even more violent than it was now. His kind had evolved here, had grown strong in this harshness. The cold and fury that meant death to others was home to him. As he descended toward the human settlement, Vorthax could see their pathetic little shelter, a box of metal and plastic that barely kept the wind out. He could sense the life signs inside, all those humans huddled together for warmth, scared and desperate. But the spark he was following wasn't inside with them. It was outside, alone, abandoned in the full fury of the storm. He found her curled against a rock formation, a tiny bundle of thermal blankets that were already stiff with ice. Her skin had turned a bluish-purple color, the sign of severe hypothermia. Frost had formed on her eyelashes and in her dark hair. By all rights, she should have been dead already. The temperature around her was cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide from the air into dry ice. No human could survive this. But her heart was still beating. Slow, irregular, barely there but beating. Her small fists were still clenched, frozen in an unconscious gesture of defiance. Even as her body shut down, even as the cold invaded her cells and began forming ice crystals in her blood, some deep part of her refused to surrender. Vorthax had seen warriors die with less determination than this child showed in simply trying to survive. Something stirred in the dragon's ancient heart. Dragons weren't sentimental creatures. They were practical, logical, built for survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. They didn't save dying things out of pity. They understood that nature was cruel and that weakness meant death. That was the way of things. That was how it had always been. But there was something else dragons valued above all else: strength. Not just physical strength but strength of will, strength of spirit. The kind of strength that made you keep fighting even when fighting was pointless. This tiny human child possessed that strength in abundance, and Vorthax recognized it the way one warrior recognizes another. He made his decision in an instant. His massive body, easily the size of the human's entire shelter, coiled around the child's small form. His wings, membranes of flexible tissue stretched between bones as thick as tree trunks, wrapped around them both like a cocoon. Inside this protective shell, he began to carefully regulate his internal temperature. A dragon's body was essentially a biological furnace. Deep inside Vorthax's core, chemical reactions produced heat intense enough to melt stone, hot enough to turn sand into glass. This was how dragons survived on Kale-9, how they'd thrived for millennia when nothing else could. But that same heat could kill a human in seconds if he wasn't careful. He had to warm her slowly, gently, like coaxing a frozen flower back to life. The air temperature inside his wing cocoon began to rise. 40 degrees below zero. 20 degrees below zero. Above freezing for the first time since the child had been abandoned. The ice in her hair began to melt. The frost on her skin started to disappear. Color slowly returned to her face, though she still looked deathly pale. Her heart rate increased. Her breathing, which had been barely detectable, became stronger. Her body was fighting back now, trying to repair the damage the cold had done. Vorthax could feel it happening, could sense her life force growing stronger instead of weaker. The tiny ember was becoming a flame again. Then her eyes opened. They were brown, dark as earth, and they stared directly into Vorthax's own eyes, which glowed like molten gold in the darkness of the storm. For a moment, neither moved. Dragon and human child, separated by millions of years of evolution, by totally different biologies and ways of thinking, simply looked at each other. Vorthax expected fear. Humans feared dragons. The few times his kind had encountered the colonists from a distance, the humans had run or hidden or tried to shoot at them with their primitive weapons. Fear was the natural response when something small met something large and powerful. Even dragon younglings feared the adult dragons until they grew strong enough to defend themselves. But this child didn't scream. She didn't try to scramble away. She didn't even look particularly afraid. Her small face, still pale from near death, showed something else entirely. Curiosity maybe. Wonder. And something that looked almost like recognition, as if she somehow understood that this massive creature had saved her life. Then she did something that would change both their lives forever. She reached out one tiny hand, fingers still trembling from the cold, and touched Vorthax's snout. Her palm barely covered one of his scales. To him, it felt like the lightest brush of a feather. But in that touch, something passed between them. Dragons had their own form of communication, something beyond words or sounds. It was a sharing of essence, of intent, of understanding. Usually this only happened between dragons. The idea that it could happen with an alien species, with a creature so fundamentally different from themselves, had never occurred to any of them. But it was happening now. In that moment of contact, Vorthax felt the child's spirit. He felt her pain, her confusion, her fear of abandonment. But he also felt her strength, her refusal to give up, her determination to live even when everyone else had decided she should die. And somehow, impossibly, she felt something from him too. His age, his power, his own form of kindness that had made him fly through a storm to save a dying stranger. The bond formed in that instant was unlike anything either species had experienced before. It wasn't ownership or domestication. It wasn't even friendship in the way humans understood it. It was something older, something more primal. It was the recognition of one warrior by another. It was the acknowledgement of strength meeting strength. It was pack, it was family, it was alliance, all wrapped into one. 15 years had passed since that frozen night when death had come for a small child and found a dragon instead. The human colony below had changed dramatically in that time. What had started as a desperate collection of survivors huddled in a makeshift shelter had grown into a fortified settlement of reinforced buildings and protective walls. They had hydroponics bays for growing food, geothermal taps for power, and defense systems to keep out the wildlife they feared. But despite all their progress, despite all their technology and planning, they lived in constant terror of the creatures that dwelled in the mountains above them. They called them the sky demons. The fire breathers. The death that comes on wings. They'd seen the dragons from a distance, massive shapes gliding through storms that would destroy any aircraft humans could build. Sometimes, during the worst weather, they'd hear roars that shook the ground beneath their feet. They knew the dragons were up there, and they knew that if those creatures ever decided to attack, their walls and weapons wouldn't mean much. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that in those same mountains they feared, one of their own had become something the galaxy had never seen before. A human girl raised by dragons, trained in their ways, transformed into a bridge between two species that shouldn't have been able to coexist at all. Maya had no memory of her human parents. Her first real memories were of warmth and safety, of being curled against Vorthax's massive side while storms raged outside their mountain cave. She remembered learning to walk by holding onto his tail for balance. She remembered her first words being in the dragon's language, a complex system of sounds that combined growls, clicks, and something almost like singing. Human speech came later, taught to her by Vorthax from fragments he'd observed, though her accent was strange, tinged with draconic pronunciation. Growing up among dragons had been nothing like a human childhood. There were no toys, no games of pretend, no gentle coddling. Dragons raised their young to be survivors, and they raised Maya the same way. By age 5, she could predict incoming storms by reading the subtle shifts in air pressure and wind patterns. By 7, she could navigate the mountain paths in complete darkness, using her other senses the way dragons did. By 10, she'd survived her first solo night in sub-zero temperatures, wrapped only in the thermal techniques Vorthax had taught her. The dragons had been skeptical at first. Vorthax's decision to save a human child had been controversial among his kind. Dragons were solitary by nature, coming together only to mate or discuss matters of great importance. The idea of raising an alien creature, especially one as fragile as a human, seemed foolish to most of them. They expected her to die within weeks, months at most. Humans weren't built for Kale-9's environment. But Maya proved them wrong in every way possible. Her human biology, combined with dragon training and something uniquely her own, allowed her to adapt in ways that shocked even the ancient dragons. Her body learned to regulate temperature more efficiently than any human should be able to. Her reflexes became sharp enough to dodge falling ice during avalanches. Her mind absorbed the dragon's teachings about survival, combat, and the complex philosophy that governed their ancient civilization. The dragons taught her their language, not just the spoken words but the deeper meaning behind them. Fire didn't just mean heat and light to dragons. It meant transformation, purification, life itself. Ice wasn't just frozen water. It was patience, endurance, the ability to wait for the right moment. She learned to read the world the way dragons did, seeing patterns in chaos, understanding the deeper rhythms of the planet's brutal ecosystem. Her weapons were gifts from the dragons themselves, though calling them gifts didn't quite capture it. When dragons shed their scales naturally, the discarded armor was harder than any metal humans could forge, lighter than their best composite materials, and sharp enough to cut through stone. The dragons allowed Maya to collect these scales and forge them into blades using techniques they taught her. Her spear was a masterwork, its edge capable of piercing the thick hide of ice bison, the massive creatures that roamed the glacial valleys. Her armor was even more remarkable. Dragons produced a silk-like substance to line their nests, a material that was completely fireproof and incredibly strong. The elder dragons, accepting that Maya was now part of their flight, helped her weave this material into armor that protected her from both extreme cold and extreme heat. Wearing it, she could walk through dragon fire itself without harm, or survive immersion in the freezing lakes that dotted the mountains. But for all her dragon training, for all her adapted abilities, Maya never forgot that she was human. She couldn't forget, because the memory of abandonment was burned into her earliest consciousness. She didn't remember the faces of those who'd left her to die, didn't remember their names or their voices. But she remembered the cold, remembered being alone, remembered the moment when she understood that the people who were supposed to protect her had chosen to let her die instead. From the high peaks where she lived, Maya could see the human colony spread out in the valley below. The dragons had excellent vision, and she'd inherited their ability to see details from incredible distances. She watched the colony grow over the years. She saw new buildings rise, saw their farms expand, saw children being born and growing up behind those protective walls. And part of her, a part she tried to ignore, wondered what her life would have been like if they'd chosen differently that night. The dragons noticed her watching, of course. Vorthax, especially, understood the conflict in her heart. He'd seen her standing at the cliff's edge countless times, staring down at the settlement, her expression unreadable. He expected her to hate them, these humans who'd thrown away one of their own to save themselves. Dragon logic was simple in such matters. Those who abandoned their young, who betrayed their flight, were enemies forever. There was no forgiveness for such things in dragon culture. But as the years passed, something else happened. The colony began to fail. Maya watched their hydroponic systems break down, the green glow of their growing bays flickering and dying. She saw their geothermal taps run dry as they exhausted the easily accessible heat sources. She observed their hunting parties returning empty-handed more often than not, their technology inadequate for tracking Kale 9's elusive prey. The colony that had grown so strong was now dying slowly, starving behind their useless walls. The dragons expected her to feel satisfaction. They thought she'd want revenge, would enjoy watching those who'd betrayed her suffer the same fate they'd intended for her. Some of the younger dragons even suggested she should help the process along, should sabotage their remaining systems or lead predators to their walls. It would be justice, they argued. It would be the natural order asserting itself. But Maya surprised them all. She didn't feel satisfaction watching the colony struggle. She felt something else entirely, something the dragons found difficult to understand. She felt sympathy. She felt concern. She felt the weight of knowing she could help them, that she possessed knowledge and skills that could save them, even after everything they'd done. The icequake hit without warning, as they always did on Kale 9. Deep beneath the planet's frozen surface, tectonic plates shifted and groaned, releasing energy that had been building for decades. The ground rippled like water, throwing people off their feet and cracking the foundations of buildings that had stood for 15 years. But the real disaster wasn't the shaking itself. It was what the shaking destroyed. The colony's thermal shield, the massive network of heat generators that kept the settlement warm enough for human survival, fractured in 17 critical places. Coolant lines ruptured. Power conduits snapped. Control systems went offline in cascading failures that the technicians couldn't stop. Within hours, the temperature inside the colony began to drop. Within a day, it would be uninhabitable. And the weather monitoring systems had just detected something worse on the horizon. A superstorm was building in the upper atmosphere, one of the massive weather systems that made Kale 9's normal ice storms look like gentle snowfall. Wind speeds in the center would exceed 300 kilometers per hour. The temperature would drop low enough to freeze methane solid. The storm would last for at least 3 days, maybe more. Nothing survived outside during a superstorm. The colony had always relied on their thermal shields to wait out such events, huddled inside while the planet raged around them. Now they had 48 hours before the storm hit, and no shield to protect them. Emergency meetings were called. Engineers worked frantically to repair the damage, but they all knew the truth. They didn't have the parts, didn't have the time, didn't have the expertise. They'd maintained the existing systems well enough, but rebuilding from scratch was beyond them. The colony administrator, a woman named Patricia Chin, finally said what everyone was thinking. They were going to die, all of them, frozen in their homes just like they'd left that child to freeze 15 years ago. Old Thomas Reed sat in the corner of the command center, listening to the panic around him. He was 73 now, his hair completely white, his hands shaking from the early stages of some neurological disease the colony doctors couldn't properly treat. He'd been the one who'd carried the child outside. He'd been the one who'd convinced everyone it was necessary, that it was the only logical choice. He'd lived with that decision for 15 years, and now it seemed like the universe was finally sending him the bill for it. When the dragon appeared on the horizon, people thought they were hallucinating from stress. It was massive, its wings stretching wider than any of their buildings. The creature's scales caught the light, flashing copper and black as it descended toward the colony. People ran for the weapon systems, ready to shoot it down, thinking this was just one more way they were going to die today. But then they saw the rider. A young woman sat on the dragon's back, her posture confident and relaxed, as if riding a creature of nightmare was the most natural thing in the world. She wore armor that looked like it was made from dragon scales themselves, and carried a spear that gleamed with an edge sharp enough to cut light. Her hair was long and dark, braided in a complex pattern, and her skin was weathered from years of exposure to Kale 9's harsh environment in ways that no colonist's skin looked. The dragon landed outside the main gate with enough force to shake the ground. The young woman slid off its back with practiced ease and walked toward the gates as if she owned the place. The guards didn't know whether to shoot her, run away, or faint. They settled for pointing their weapons at her with trembling hands and demanding she identify herself. She looked at them with eyes that were strangely familiar to some of the older colonists, though they couldn't quite place why. When she spoke, her voice was strong and clear, though her accent was strange, almost musical in a way that human speech shouldn't be. "My name is Maya Cole," she said, "and I'm here to save you." Again. The name hit the older colonists like a physical blow. Cole. There had been a family named Cole on the original ship, a biologist and her engineer husband. They'd died in the early days, leaving behind a daughter who the colony had voted to abandon. But that was impossible. That child would have died 15 years ago. No human could survive outside during an ice storm, especially not a 3-year-old. Thomas Reed pushed through the crowd, his old eyes straining to see the young woman clearly. When their gazes met, his heart stopped for a moment. Those eyes. He'd seen those eyes before, looking up at him trustingly as he carried a small child out into the cold to die. Those were Cole's eyes, the mother's eyes, passed down to her daughter who should have been dead. "Dear God," he whispered. "What have we done?" Maya's expression didn't change. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times during her years in the mountains. She'd imagined being angry, being cruel, making them suffer the way she'd suffered. But now that she was here, now that she was looking at these scared, desperate people who were about to die just like they'd left her to die, she felt something different. She felt tired. Tired of carrying hatred. Tired of imagining revenge. Just tired. "The superstorm will hit in 46 hours, she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Your thermal shield is destroyed. You have no way to survive it with your current technology. But I do. The dragons do. We've survived countless storms worse than this one. We can teach you. We can help you. We can save every person in this colony." Hope flickered in the crowd, desperate and fragile. Patricia Chin stepped forward, the colony administrator trying to maintain some authority even though she was clearly terrified of both the dragon and the young woman. "Why would you help us? After what we did to you?" Maya smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. "That's a good question. The dragons asked me the same thing. They don't understand why I'd want to save the people who left me to die. In dragon culture, such betrayal is unforgivable. They expected me to let you all freeze, to let nature take its course. They said it would be justice." She paused, letting the words sink in. People shifted uncomfortably, knowing she was right, knowing they deserved whatever judgment she chose to pass. "But I'm not a dragon," Maya continued. "I'm human. And humans, for better or worse, have this strange ability to forgive even the unforgivable. So yes, I'll help you. The dragons will teach you how to survive on Kale 9 properly, how to work with this planet instead of fighting against it. But there's a condition." The crowd held its breath, waiting for the price of their salvation. "Everyone who voted to abandon me that night will stand before me and explain why they made that choice. I won't hurt you. I won't punish you. But you will face what you did. You will look me in the eye and own your decision. That's all I ask." The transformation began immediately, and it was unlike anything the colonists had ever experienced. Maya didn't just give them instructions and leave. She lived among them, bringing the dragon's ancient wisdom into every aspect of their survival. The first lesson was the hardest for the humans to accept because it went against everything they'd been taught about colonization and survival. "Stop fighting the planet," Maya told them on that first day, as workers frantically tried to rebuild the thermal shield before the superstorm hit. "You've been treating Kale 9 like an enemy for 15 years. You build walls to keep it out, shields to block its cold, weapons to fight its creatures. You're exhausted because you're in a constant war you can never win." The chief engineer, a man named David Park who'd been with the colony since the beginning, shook his head in frustration. "What choice do we have? This planet is trying to kill us every single day. The temperature alone would freeze us solid in minutes." Maya smiled and gestured to herself, standing there in the brutal cold wearing only her dragon-scale armor, seemingly unbothered by temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in less than an hour. "The dragons have lived here for thousands of years. They don't fight Kale 9. They're part of it. And now so am I. You can be too, but first you have to change how you think." What followed was a crash course in survival that revolutionized everything the colony thought they knew. The dragons, working through Maya as translator and intermediary, taught them to build structures from ice itself. Not the fragile ice humans knew, but a special form created by carefully controlling temperature and pressure, mixed with mineral compounds from the mountains. These ice structures were stronger than steel, naturally insulated, and actually grew more stable in the cold rather than less. The colony's hydroponics had always struggled because they required enormous amounts of energy to maintain the warm, controlled environments Earth plants needed. The dragons introduced them to Kale 9's native plant species, organisms that had evolved to photosynthesize using the planet's unique light spectrum and actually thrived in sub-zero temperatures. These plants weren't pretty by Earth standards, but they were nutritious, fast-growing, and required a fraction of the energy to cultivate. Geothermal energy had always been part of the colony's power strategy, but they'd been tapping it inefficiently, using Earth-designed systems that weren't suited to Kale 9's unique geology. The dragons showed them vents and heat sources the humans had never detected, places where the planet's internal heat came close to the surface in ways that could be harvested without complex machinery. Within weeks, the colony had more power than they'd ever had before, and it was completely renewable. But the most remarkable gift the dragons shared was their metallurgy. In massive caverns deep within the mountains, the dragons maintained forges heated by their own internal fire, hot enough to work with materials that human furnaces couldn't even melt. They showed the colonists alloys and compounds that combined Kale 9's native minerals in ways that created materials with properties that seemed impossible. Metal that stayed flexible at temperatures that should make it brittle. Ceramics that could withstand both extreme heat and extreme cold without cracking. Composites that were lighter than plastic but harder than diamond. Maya worked 18-hour days translating between species, demonstrating techniques, troubleshooting problems. She taught colonists how to read weather patterns the way dragons did, to predict storms days in advance by watching cloud formations and feeling atmospheric pressure changes. She showed hunters how to track ice bison and other prey using dragon methods, teaching them to think like predators instead of relying on technology that often failed in Kale 9's harsh conditions. The superstorm came and went. The colony, sheltered in their newly built ice structures and warmed by properly tapped geothermal heat, barely noticed it. What would have killed them all just weeks before was now just another weather event to wait out. The psychological impact of this was enormous. For the first time since landing on Kale 9, the colonists didn't feel like they were constantly on the edge of extinction. They felt like they might actually have a future here. Not everyone accepted the changes easily. Some colonists, especially the older ones, resented taking orders from someone they'd left to die. They resented even more that she'd survived and thrived while they'd struggled. But as the months passed and life became undeniably better, even the skeptics had to admit that Maya and the dragons had given them something precious: hope. The judgment sessions Maya had required were painful for everyone involved. 24 people had voted to abandon her that night 15 years ago. 6 had died in the intervening years, but the other 18 stood before her one by one and explained their reasoning. Some tried to justify it logically, talking about resource scarcity and survival mathematics. Others broke down crying, admitting they'd made a terrible choice out of fear. A few remained defiant, insisting they'd do the same thing again if faced with the same circumstances. Maya listened to each one without interruption, her face carefully neutral. When they were done, she didn't condemn them or absolve them. She simply said, "Thank you for your honesty," and moved on to the next person. The colonists expected anger or revenge, but she gave them something harder to process: indifference. She'd moved beyond their choices, had become something greater than their worst moment could touch. Dr. Lisa Morgan was the last to stand before Maya. She'd been the young idealistic physician who'd voted against abandonment, who'd argued passionately to keep the child, who'd cried when Thomas Reed carried her outside. 15 years of guilt had aged her prematurely. Her hands shook as she approached Maya. "I voted against it," Lisa said, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried to stop them. But I didn't try hard enough. I should have done more. I should have refused to let it happen. I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." For the first time during the judgment sessions, Maya's neutral expression cracked. She stepped forward and, to everyone's shock, hugged the older woman. "You did what you could," she said softly. "Sometimes that's all anyone can do." 3 years after Maya's return, the Galactic Council's response ship finally arrived. The Council was a loose federation of spacefaring species that monitored developing colonies and responded to distress signals, though their response times were measured in years due to the vast distances involved. They'd received the Prometheus Dawn's emergency beacon and sent a rescue mission, expecting to find either a thriving colony or graves. What they found instead left them speechless. The Council representatives, a mix of species from across known space, landed to find humans and dragons working side by side. They saw buildings that combined Earth architecture with dragon design principles. They watched human children playing with young dragons, both species learning each other's languages. They observed technology that blended human innovation with dragon wisdom in ways that shouldn't have been possible.